Welcome to the Neurostimulation Podcast. I'm Michael Passmore, Clinical Associate Professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. The Neurostimulation Podcast is all about bringing cutting-edge neuroscience and neurostimulation education to you every week free of charge. We're going to explore the latest research and how that research is being translated into real-world treatments that can improve health and well-being. I wanted to also mention that this podcast is separate from my clinical and academic roles and is part of my effort to bring neuroscience education to the general public free of charge. Accordingly, I just want to remind you that the information shared and discussed here today is intended for educational purposes only and not as medical advice or a substitute for professional medical guidance. Today, I'm really looking forward to a discussion with a truly multifaceted guest, Joel Bouchard. Joel is a doctoral student in psychology, a multi-instrumentalist record producer, an author, a painter, an Army veteran, a business leader, and a local government official, as well as a podcaster. He describes himself as a generalist who thrives on connecting diverse fields of knowledge. Today, we're going to explore the benefits of being a generalist, how creativity and psychology intersect, lessons from his time in the military, and much more. Joel, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
So maybe you can start by introducing yourself to us and telling us a little about your background and expanding on some of those concepts that I introduced there at the beginning.
Yeah. So I'll give you just a little bit more detail on my background. So I'm a podcaster as well. I have a philosophy podcast from nowhere to nothing. I just found out we're in the top 5% of podcasts globally. I had another podcaster reach out to me and tell me, so I wasn't aware. But so we do pretty well. It's me and my resident expert, who is a former philosophy professor of mine. And usually what we'll do is we'll look at one word or two words, and we'll delve into sort of the formative aspects of it, what philosophers have said historically about it. And then we'll discuss, what it means today in the context of the historical evaluation. And then we'll talk about speculative elements. What does it mean for humankind, or what does it mean for us personally? But each week we spend about an hour just looking at one concept. So that's the podcast side of it. My day job is I'm a production manager for a manufacturing facility. We make parts for the safety industry and the power grid. And then I'm a village trustee in the village I live in. So I oversee public safety, fire and police, parks and recreation, as well as a few other things. Then, yeah, as you can see, I'm kind of in my studio right now. So I play 7 different instruments, and I record them all separately, put them all together, and I like to release some albums online. So if you Google my name, or you put it into Apple Music or Spotify, wherever, you'll find my music, and you could listen to it. I like to paint. I just released a novel that I wrote, The Sleeper, the Scholar, and the Strix, that can be found on Amazon. And that's kind of scratching the surface a little bit. I'm a PhD student in psychology, and I like to 3D print. I like to ride motorcycles. I like to do some astrophotography. I like to mountain climb, so all kinds of different stuff. But that's kind of the
cool.
background.
Yeah, I know, that's incredible. That's really, thank you for summarizing that. For folks watching and listening, we'll put all the links to get access to all of Joel's content. We'll put those in the show notes so that you can definitely explore that. I would highly encourage you to. I'm going to, for sure. So Joel, just remind me now, whereabouts are you based?
So I'm in Western New York. So, you hear about Buffalo getting 6 feet of snow in a day. I'm pretty close to that area. So we're in the depths of winter right now.
Right. Okay. Well, I won't bring up the NFL. Sorry, it's too late now. I just did.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, it's a sore topic around here right now. But yeah.
I heard the officiating was left a lot to be desired. But in any event.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, like, it's very impressive, wide-ranging interests and skills for sure. And I think that it kind of speaks to my first thoughts and question in terms of your description of yourself as a generalist, and in a world that often kind of channels people into specific silos and rewards hyper specialization. I was curious to know, what do you see as some of the biggest advantages of being a generalist in that kind of social milieu?
Yeah, I think I sort of have an evolving view of it as life goes on. I think that in many ways, uh, our society and our culture still do reward specialization to a large degree. If you consider reward, monetary success, like I'm very lucky in the fact that I've achieved some of the position that I have, and I believe that the position that I have achieved is due to my generalist abilities. You know, uh, well, being an army vet as well, right? I've done a lot of work with my hands, a lot of manual labor, but I've also done a lot of intellectual, academic work, and I've done a lot of people work. And so, most organizations, you can find a management role for a person like that, right? You want somebody who is intellectually capable and has interpersonal skills. But it also helps if you have somebody who's worked with their hands a little bit, so they can kind of understand what the people on the floor are doing and what they're working with. So I love my job. It's great. It's a good mix of work without being too stressful or overwhelming, that type of thing. But I think that really the rewarding aspect of being a generalist isn't that stuff, right? I think that if you want to make a lot of money and that's your idea of living a good life, then specialize. Specialize in something, and that you'll be good off. But I think that what I've learned as life goes on is that that's just such a small part of what success means as a human being. And I think that that's really where being a generalist is rewarding, is
Mm.
looking at life through a philosophical lens and a psychological lens and an
Mm.
artistic lens, and the lens of somebody who's been in the military and who's worked in a factory. And the more perspectives you can gain on it, the more you can identify with people from diverse backgrounds, the more you start to see life in as objective a way as you possibly can. None of us ever can, right? We all live with our own subjectivity.
Mm.
Um, but you can approach a variety of situations and have a keener insight into them than somebody would who didn't take those routes.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. That makes sense. It reminds me of this metaphor. I'm working on an essay, and from years ago, I had this memory of a really interesting metaphor from a book called Sophie's World by Jostein Gaarder. I don't know if you know that book, but it's kind of a fictional tour through the history of philosophy, basically. And the metaphor that he uses is a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat. And he considers, what if, a person's a tiny, tiny little person that's clinging to one strand of fur on the rabbit that's being pulled out of the hat. Now, it's bear with me, because the metaphor kind of makes sense, although it sounds strange. But most people, being specialists, are tending to kind of want to burrow right down and towards the skin of the rabbit, where they kind of find their own little warm niche, and they kind of live out their life with their specialization in their own little silo. But what he's encouraging in the metaphor is for people to do the opposite, to climb the strand of fur and to come up and eventually sort of look at the magician in the eye, so to speak, and getting into kind of more philosophical and maybe spiritual kinds of advantages to not necessarily specializing, but, as you say, approach life in a much more balanced way, which I think probably makes perfect sense in terms of lending itself to health and wellness, as opposed to burnout and isolation that often happens, I think, in people who cling too tightly to a specialization. Even though, of course, we do need specialists, and there's definitely benefits to having specialized expertise. But yeah, no, it's super interesting.
Yeah, and you can be a specialist in your career field too, and still be a generalist as a person. And I think that that's really the definition of personal growth, right? Of self actualization. And yeah, your metaphor there is really great, because and it encapsulates a couple things that are what make a generalist special, and what is kind of the key to life in some ways for me, the way I think about it. And one of them is, is confronting uncomfortable things, right? Which is
Mm.
what philosophy is all about, right? Thinking about, hey, what happens after you die?
Mm.
Or where did the universe come from?
Yeah.
And these questions that keep people up at night. You're aware, as with psychology, the more you familiarize yourself with some of these concepts, the less scary they become, right? It's kind of this
Yeah.
immersion therapy type thing. And the other part of it is, it's the same thing with failure, right? It's this idea of reinterpreting what failure means. And if you're a real generalist, you'll run up against that quite a bit. You
Mm.
don't. It's easy if you're a specialist to, okay, I learned one thing and at the beginning I wasn't very good, but now I'm a master. And then you kind of let that status of being a master, being an expert, become the defining aspect of your personality. But if you're a generalist, if you're always learning something new, then you're always in the process of failing. I'm failing all the time at something.
Yeah.
But rather than viewing failure as an end, it's more, what's the saying? You've never failed until you stop failing, right? So
Yeah.
it's more just learning, right? You're
Yeah.
just constantly learning new things, and with learning comes difficulties, obstacles, and learning how to problem solve. And so I think that's why if you look throughout history and you see people who were polymaths or Renaissance men or whoever, I think that's why they tend to be philosophers first and foremost, right? Is because, again, the more things that you do and the more aspects you kind of look at life in order to live that kind of life, you really can't be daunted by failure. You're always learning new things, and you come to become very comfortable with things that might make other people very uneasy. But I think that doing those things, confronting things that make people uneasy, and becoming okay with not getting things right the first time, is sort of the key to becoming comfortable with a lot of the things that cause burnout and stress for people in our kind of modern society.
Yeah, definitely. 100%. It really speaks to the importance of balance, and maintaining that balance also helps to kind of prevent burnout and keep interested in different things that one gets interested in, right? Without, kind of getting too focused in on, I think there's a tendency sometimes for people to get focused in on something they're super interested in, and then that comes at the expense of perhaps other things that need to be attended to. But by kind of sampling different interests and trying to spread time and attention in a healthy way, that can also be something that sustains the ability to continue to be productive in a variety of domains. And so you kind of get the best of both worlds in that sense.
Yeah, and I think that's another sort of difficulty with being an expert, right? Is that we've all heard that in order to become an expert, it's something you have to spend 10,000 hours doing it, right?
Mm.
Well, something that comes along with those 10,000 hours is, again, that sense of familiarity, that practice, it's sort of hard packs things, and I think when you always have something you can bounce around to, it kind of keeps it fresh. Like music is a good one for me because I've been doing music for a very long time now. And one thing I've always noticed, is you listen to an artist and, okay, man, uh, maybe their first album isn't real great. Then the second one's a little bit better. Then the third one's awesome. And then the fourth one sounds a little bit stale. And then anything beyond that is kind of, and you go, what happened? Why is that sort of the trend?
Mm.
And I think that part of that is this practice effect. When you're first learning something, you have these creative insights. You have the ability to see things in a fresh way. And if you get too wound up in practice, and with music, you can do technical practice, right? You can run through scales, you can run through chords, you can run through drum fills or whatever it happens to be, and you'll become technically better.
Mm.
But at the same time, you're wearing ruts in your mind as to things you can sort of fall back on when in a creative sense, and that's something that's detrimental to creating new, exciting things, right?
Yeah.
And so I try to practice creatively, is what I call it. Where, okay, well, if I'm going to sit down and practice rather than running through the same things over and over, I've got that muscle memory already. I know what the chords are. I know what the scales are. Instead, I'm going to try to play something that I've never played before.
Mhm.
And then usually that will lead, as soon as you play something, you go, oh, wait, wow, that's something I've never done. That's kind of cool. And then it connects to this thing. And then I can kind of pull in some of the old things that I've done before and make something new out of it,
Yeah.
or, just like we were saying, jump into a different thing altogether, going to painting or going to writing, and then coming back and not practicing. There's been times in my life where I haven't touched an instrument for 2 or 3 months, and then
Mhm.
come back to music and then immediately have just a rush of new ideas. Um, so I'm not a huge proponent of you should practice every day the same thing over and over again so that it becomes second nature. I think that there's a place for a little bit of that at the beginning,
Yeah.
in order to get the muscle memory. But then after that, I think that really practice should be a creative endeavor in itself to some extent.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that's great. I'm taking notes because, my kids are involved with, piano lessons and such. And sometimes it's a challenge to encourage that. But, the thing is really, and I regret this because, I kind of bailed on piano lessons prematurely now looking back at, thinking I could have probably continued on with that and would have enjoyed being able to, produce the music on the other end. But having the challenge of just encouraging the kids, but framing it in that sense, I think hopefully we'll have some purchase in terms of their willingness to knuckle down and, do the chords and do the repetitive work that seems boring at the time, but as you say, is necessary to build the muscle memory and get that mastery so that the enjoyment then comes out of the skill that one develops, right? So 100%. And it makes me think of, what you were referring to just now about the importance of learning to work with your hands and do physical activities and balancing that with intellectual pursuits for the same reason. I always valued working for my dad who had a construction company, and so it gave me 2/3 of the year in school and a third of the year in the summers working outside with my hands. And I just think that that was so valuable as part of just balancing growth and development through college years. And it was really something that I'm going to try and encourage my own kids to do, and that I would encourage others to really try and find that type of balance in terms of the physicality of activity that people are engaged in from day to day.
Yeah, there's two aspects of it, right? We know that there's a lot of research that's coming out that just being in nature, just being outside is really good for us. But then on top of that, there's sort of the kind of common sense but overlooked fact that you can't have a strong mind without a strong body. And so being physical, making sure that you're taking care of yourself physically is the first step to really enjoying things from and not just from a cognitive or an academic standpoint, but even just feeling good in your regular everyday life. I'm very busy, but I always make sure that I'm getting 8 hours of sleep, and I'm trying to follow a good diet, and I'm working out. And not every day it's going to happen, but if the pattern of behavior is right, then it sets you up for success. You feel better. You have a better mood. You think clearer, and you can kind of approach life in a way that you're ready for. I think that it lessens that burnout state. But
Yeah, no, for sure, definitely. It is super important because, as you say, it's again, it comes back to balance, right? So just making sure that those key activities, the prioritization of self-care in terms of, as you say, I think I agree, those are three great pillars in terms of the sleep, the diet and the physical activity, whether it's exercise or forms of activity that basically serve as exercise, but maybe incorporate some sort of interests as well, like gardening or what have you, particularly later on in life when maybe other more strenuous forms of exercise aren't necessarily as feasible, for sure. And I'm really curious, you're like, I would be really interested to know your thoughts about the intersection between psychology and music, right? Because I think with music, it is this sort of very, I was actually listening to another podcast just earlier today called Theories of Everything. It's a great one. I don't know if you've heard that, or I'd encourage you and any of the audience listening and watching now to check it out with Kurt Jaimungal. It's called Theories of Everything. And he was talking to Ian McGilchrist, who sort of has this idea about right brain, right hemisphere functioning. And I know that the sort of stereotypical perspective on that is that the right brain for most people is more of the sort of open and artistic side, and the left brain is more of the analytical kind of sort of logic-based side. This is more complicated than that's a bit of a mischaracterization. But in any event, I mean, I think the notion of using all parts of the brain kind of in different ways to kind of just get the whole brain sort of functioning in a synchronized way, and balancing that type of thing that we're talking about, with the music and the psychology and the intellectual inquiry into different sorts of philosophical areas as well. So, but yeah, like specifically, I'm curious to know your thoughts on that intersection between music and psychology, and what you find are the benefits, or what are your interests in that regard.
Yeah, music is really cool psychologically, right? Because I mean, I'm sure you're well aware, music touches on so many different parts of the brain, and I think that that's what makes it so resilient in the face of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and things, where somebody might not be able to remember their name or anything, but you can play a song and they'll remember it. And so even something like speech, right, has three brain areas. We got Wernicke's and Broca's in the left side, but then on the right side, you have one that's associated with the melody of the words, right? And, you can do this cool experiment where if you just take a short clip of audio of somebody talking like we are right now, and you loop just a couple seconds of it over and over again, all of a sudden your brain will make it into a song. Like you can feel the melody of it, right?
Huh.
And so it's music is sort of baked into the base layer of our psychology, which is fascinating because it's not something that really exists in nature. We think of bird songs as being musical, but really that's just their kind of form of communication. Music is a wholly human endeavor in many ways. So psychologically, it's just fascinating. It's super cool. And I think that I do well with it because I have mixed dominance, right? I was meant to be left-handed, so I'm left side dominant. But in kindergarten, I was switching between my left and my right hand writing, and I was, writing letters backwards and all kinds of crazy stuff. And finally, my exasperated first grade teacher at one point grabbed my right hand and said, "From now on, you only write with this hand." I said, "Whoa, okay, all right, that's what I'll do." So I became right-handed, but I have a dominant left eye and left leg. So in soccer, I always play the left striker and kick with the left foot. And I've got all kinds of weird stuff now where I'll shoot a rifle in the Army right-handed, but I'll shoot a bow and arrow left-handed, and it's all crazy. So in some ways, it can kind of screw you up a little bit, but in other ways, it opens the possibilities that I have, and music's one of them, right? Another one is like driving a manual car. My first car was a standard shift and nobody had to teach me, right? I just got in and started doing it because I had that coordination between the limbs. Same thing with drums, right? I didn't really have to struggle to learn how to coordinate all the limbs that most people do when they start playing drums. I was able to just kind of sit behind the kit and start playing. So this communication between the analytical side of the brain, the creative side of the brain, I think that's something that I have a particular knack for because of that case, that mixed dominance case. And it causes me issues in other ways, right? One of them is auditory processing, where as long as things are totally quiet like they are now, I have perfect hearing, right? I have it tested, 0 decibels of hearing loss across the whole spectrum. But if there's background noise, all of a sudden I can't make out anything that a voice is saying, like nothing. Even on like a bad phone connection, I can't make out anything, So yeah, the brain, how it's working in the context of this auditory input, right? And what parts of the brain, the creative aspects and the analytical aspects and the melodic and the verbal, and how all of those things mesh and connect to make music, right? We don't think of it as being as complicated as it is. And it's not something that's difficult for me. So oftentimes I forget it myself. I work very fast, where I'll write and record a whole album in a week, and release it and not think anything of it. But when you really start to consider the mechanics of it, or you talk with somebody who does struggle with putting the different pieces together, they go, well, I can think of a melody, but I don't know what the harmony should be to it, or I have no sense of rhythm, or I can't think of any words for the lyrics. You know, you go, this is a very complicated phenomenon. This is not
Mm,
something that's very easy, but we humans are so good at it, and we're the only animal that does it, that we're just immersed in it all the time. You know, it's
yeah.
really pretty wild.
Yeah, yeah. I know I've always been like, I'm a huge music fan. As I said, I bailed on lessons prematurely, and unfortunately I can't play anything, but I'm a huge music fan. And I've always been fascinated by, what is it that the analytical part of me, thinks like, maybe even especially these days with AI, there must be some way of cracking the code, right? Like, what is it that makes a song or an album a masterpiece, right? And what is it that makes something else that kind of has similar ingredients, like the equivalent to Muzak that you might hear when you're shopping, right? Like right now, I'm pretty obsessed with Noah Kahan. I don't know. I mean, my wife makes fun of me because she sort of compares me with like a teenage girl or something. But I mean, I think it's just, there's something about his songwriting and his melodies, as you say, the bridges. It's just captivating. I'm pretty obsessed with that most recent album.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that this is where philosophy comes in, right? Like, because the fact of the matter is, taste in music is subjective. So, what I consider good music will be different from you, which will be different from everybody on the planet. Um, but I think that at its core, if we were sort of going to pick it apart, what I've always said, being somebody who makes music, who writes novels, who paints pictures, is that with any form of art, you're trying to deliver something that the audience wants in a way that they didn't expect.
Mm,
And getting that balance right is why art is so difficult, because if you deliver what the audience wants in exactly the way they expect, then it's boring. You know, it's lifeless. You know, you go, oh, okay, well, I saw that coming from a mile away. And if you deliver, you know, if you give them something that they don't want, well, then I think that that's sort of abstract or avant-garde. You know, you go, what is this? Like, I don't, I can't, there's no chorus to latch onto. There's no figures in the painting to see. The story doesn't go anywhere, something like that. So I think that that's the balance, is trying to find what people like, what people want, and then get them there, give it to them in a sneaky way, in a creative way, you know.
mm,
And
yeah.
so that's kind of what I was doing when I was writing my book. As when I initially went to write my novel, um, I didn't really think I was going to write a novel. I had just been interested in mythology and Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, and this idea that the structure of stories is uniform across cultures. And the thought occurred to me, I wonder how far you can start twisting some of those tropes or some of those steps and still have a story that's entertaining and cohesive and that people
Mm,
enjoy. But twist some of those stereotypes a little bit. And I'm really happy with the way it came out. You know, it's one of those things where I look at it, and I go, this story doesn't really have a main character, right? It doesn't
mm.
really have, but it still kind of comes together in a satisfying way. So that was something that I was pretty proud of. But yeah, that's kind of my view on just any art in general. Is people have some sort of intrinsic desire for something. You know, whether in music it's a
Mhm.
certain melodic pattern, or figures that you see in art, or tropes that we encounter in stories. People have a need to see those things fulfilled, but they don't want to know it's coming. There has to be some suspense. There has to be
Mhm.
some conflict.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It speaks to the importance of the surprise of something, right? Just sort of being something unexpected or surprising. The other thought that I just had as you were describing that is this idea of, in a way, in the artistic process of just sort of presuming from the outset that doesn't really matter if anyone actually likes it, right? It's sort of because then that builds in, if you are sort of more I mean, of course there are these other commercial sorts of considerations, but I guess that's kind of the artist's dilemma in a way, right? To try to ignore that, at least at the outset, it makes me think of Rick Rubin, I think, talks about that, right? And this idea about just produce art as if you're writing in your diary and you're presuming that no one's ever going to be reading your diary, kind of thing, which I think is super interesting also. That speaks to this idea of expressing yourself in a genuine way and the vulnerability that goes along with that as an artist who's producing, basically wearing their heart on their sleeve in that sense.
Yes, and we're coming back to aspects of the generalist again, and I think this is why, again, polymaths and Renaissance men tend to be artists, is because once you've again confronted failure, and you've sort of integrated that into part of your process, and you're going about your life that certain way, it becomes less embarrassing. I remember music was kind of the first thing that I did. So at one point I was good at music, but I didn't do anything else. And at that point, I was always very nervous. I go, oh man, I don't know if I should put this out. Are people going to like it? Are people not going to like it? But after you do so many things, it just kind of comes to the point where I refer to myself as the world's worst marketer because, like you mentioned, I don't really care. I don't really care if people engage with stuff, because I'm doing it for myself, at this point. And it's the podcast. Well, I mentioned at the beginning, right? I had to have another podcaster whose show I had been on had to tell me that my podcast was in the top 5% globally because I just don't check, right? And that's sort of an encapsulation of the podcast ecosystem, right? Is a lot of people get into podcasting, and when they don't see instant results, they drop out. And so, 90% of podcasts don't make it 10 episodes or something like that. But from the outset, the reason that we were doing our podcast was just to try to recreate the conversations that we used to have in philosophy class, right? And so we didn't really care. We didn't really care if anybody listened. It was more just about documenting these conversations so that we had them for the future. And if anybody else wanted to join in, they could. And that, paradoxically is what leads to success. What leads to success is doing the things that are important to you and that you enjoy. Because if you don't have that intrinsic motivation, you'll never get the head of steam that you need to get to a point where you can be extrinsically rewarded for what you're doing. So it's paradoxical, but I think that is sort of the key and Rick Rubin's a great example, right? Because when he got big, during the 80s, that was during a time when, huge reverbs and glam metal were sort of dominating the scene. He had this very stripped down sound that was the total opposite of that. And what happens is, you find people who have a desire for that aesthetic, but that weren't being served by the music industry. And so now he gains a following and becomes big. So you never know what that thing is. But as a creative person, that's what you're looking for, right? You're looking for that giving people what they want in a way that they didn't know they wanted it. And if there's an audience for it, then it picks up from there.
Yeah, for sure. No, I mean, in terms of things like, Joseph Campbell or Jungian types of symbolism, it's interesting to think about things like beginner's mind, and or concepts like the fool being the precursor to the savior. And I think that part of what we're kind of indoctrinated in as far as Western societies are concerned is this notion that right from the very beginning, when we're little kids and going through the grade school system, it's sort of, really looked down upon. It's disparaged, this kind of idea about being a novice and not knowing and being at the bottom of the totem pole and having to build up the knowledge and the skills in order to sort of prove yourself in that sense. And you lose. I guess that's the other thing why they say that, all children are artists, you just lose that. Some people just lose that by virtue of, going through the meat grinder of the educational, system and coming out on the other end as a productive worker, what have you,
Yeah. And I think that there's two sort of aspects to that as well. One of them that's helped by being the generalist is that, again, the more things you engage with, whenever you go to start a new thing, you have a wider base of knowledge to start from. So I was listening to one of the shows that you did, before we did this interview. I can't remember the guy's name, but he's an Australian guy that was in the military.
Oh, right.
And
Yeah.
he's talking
Tim
about,
Collins. Mhm.
he's talking about breath work during, during shooting. And I go, oh, yeah, I know how to do that. Right.
Mhm.
Because I have that in my background. I have that in my repertoire. Right. So, and, breath work carries through. And that's sort of the other aspect of it is, this integration of analytical and creative thought. There was a point where with music, it started out creative and then it became very analytical. So, now anytime I hear a song, I'm going, all right, what are the drums doing? What's the guitar doing? What's this doing? What'd they do with EQ and compression to make the production this way?
Mm.
And then all of a sudden music starts to kind of lose its life a little bit, right? But then getting into breath work, right? Starting to do some Zen meditation, um, opens this awareness that allows you to sort of transition between a holistic and analytical view of things. So now all of a sudden I go, oh, I can hear the song as one thing again, and I can sense the emotion behind it and sort of what it was intended to be.
Mm.
Whereas before that, part of this ingrained practice is just picking it apart, and it loses its magic when you do that, right? You're kind of peeking behind the curtain. You're opening up the hood, seeing how the thing works. Then once
Mm.
you see how the thing works, it loses a bit of its magic. It loses a bit of its appeal.
Yeah.
And so getting that back is important for an artist, right? Being able to look at something holistically and being able to put the rational mind away and let the affective aspect of things you're engaging with affect you in a way that you can interpret and you can deconstruct and you can use in your own things. But at the same time, holistically seeing them as somebody who is not an artist, right? Who doesn't know how to
Mm.
play music or doesn't know how to paint or write. How do they see it? It's really important that you don't lose that perspective. You need to keep that in order to continue to make good art, I think.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's for sure. That's cool. It makes me think of a really great book that I read a number of years ago called "This Is Your Brain on Music" by Dan Levitan, who was, I think, it was initially a sound engineer or some sort of music producer, and then he went on to become a neuroscientist, and he wrote this cool book, "This Is Your Brain on Music." It's really interesting, and it talks quite a bit about this type of thing.
Yeah, I think I read that one years ago. Yeah.
I was just curious then, along those lines, do you think there are certain cognitive advantages to being a musician or an artist in general?
Yeah, I think so. Um, a musician is interesting because I think that it makes you for me personally, like I'm better able to locate sound sources. Like I can identify the Doppler effect just walking around. You can go, okay, all right, so I hear this thing moving in pitch as I'm moving, so I kind of know where the location of it is, and I can know what hertz it's playing at, and that sort of thing. So I think some differentiation is easier. Again, I struggle with it just because I think that I have you know uh, an auditory processing issue because of some of the mixed dominant stuff. But I think that in by and large, picking out and being able to analyze sounds is a little bit easier. Um, and our I think that our being artistic is really in a lot of ways a problem solving skill.
Mm.
Um, for the reason that I mentioned, right? You're always trying to find that balance when you're creating good art, of that way of, okay, well, what is it that people are going to want to hear? But, you write out, you go, okay, well, this is too boring, right? Just verse, chorus. They're going to know exactly what's happening. So now I gotta mix something up. Either got to throw a bridge in there, or I've got to change some words to the second chorus, or I've got to, do a key shift, key change in the last chorus. I've got to do something to make this interesting, right? And I think that can follow through to everyday things, just the problem solving aspect of it. That's really just a creative interpretation of your surroundings to some extent.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it makes me think of this. It's an attractive kind of way of framing an approach to life in general, in terms of having it be a creativity kind of project, right? So, I mean, people talk about work and going to work, and I think that if you bring a creativity mindset to work, then I think that is a way of having seemingly mundane things become perhaps more enjoyable, right? If
Yeah,
someone, yeah,
yeah. And I mean that's basically the way that I live my life. Is again, at the beginning of the episode, we mentioned a whole bunch of stuff that I do, and people are always asking me, well, how do you find time to do it? Right.
That was going to be my next question, actually.
And I always tell them, well, yeah, I sleep 8 hours a night, right? I have a marriage, I've been married 13 years. I've got a happy social life. I do all these things, but it is problem solving. It's creative problem solving to some extent. And it's finding a way to, and here's where it becomes a perspective thing, right? Because it hasn't been this way my whole life. I did run into a situation a few years ago where I was starting to feel kind of burned out because I kept just adding things, right? Nothing was going away. But, I got promoted at work, and then, I got into the government, the local government gig. And then, things just kept getting added on. I go, oh, I'm like drowning. And that's when I started meditation. And through that, there was just a change in mindset, right? Because, that's sort of the founding philosophy of a lot of the Eastern philosophy is that, reality beyond the objective thing that's out there is primarily how you subjectively engage with it. And so it's when you start to understand that, then you begin to reinterpret stress in a lot of ways.
Mm.
And so, when I'm thinking, okay, well, how am I going to do this or how am I going to do that? It's easy to say, oh, well, I don't have time, and now I'm stressed.
Mm.
But it's another thing to say, oh, okay, well, no, this is just a problem that requires a creative solution. What sort of things can I do differently in order to accommodate stuff? Oh, well, you know what? I can meal plan, so I can kind of set out my meals for the week, and then I don't have to dedicate any mental energy to it. Hey, I don't need this many clothes. I'm gonna strip it down to 3 color T-shirts, black, white, and gray, and then I don't ever have to think about it. And then, just try to arrange things and find a way to fit them in like a puzzle piece.
Mhm.
And when that happens, and then engaging with the problems themselves, right? Because, we have an immediate feedback environment versus a delayed feedback environment. And, delayed feedback environment, you're putting this effort in and you're not knowing if it's paying off or not. Well, if you sort of reinterpret it and say, no, what I'm doing right now is intrinsically valuable for its own sake.
Yeah.
So even if I'm at work, right? Okay, well, I'm gonna get a paycheck, and I probably wouldn't show up if they weren't gonna give me a paycheck. But at the same time, work's filled with a lot of interesting people, right? There's always interesting problems to solve. And again, there's that key sort of mindset shift, right? Is there stressful, overwhelming obstacles, or is there interesting problems to solve?
Yeah.
And it's not as easy as just talking yourself into it. I don't want to present it that way. It does take it takes work, right? It takes
Mhm.
time to accommodate that mindset shift, but it can be done, right? And when it is done properly, my wife kind of gets mad at me because we go to bed at night, and I'll say goodnight and I'll take one deep breath and then I'm sleeping. She goes, how, with all of the things that you do, how are you not just staying up at night worried about it? And I go, because I just do my best and I have fun. And then when I'm done, I know that I can't do any more and I don't let it bother me,
Yeah.
that's sort of, I think that's what life should be, right? It should be,
Mhm.
you should be doing things that you want to do. And we can't all do things that we want to do all the time. So what's the next best thing? Well, if you can't beat them, join them. If you have to do something you don't want to do, act like you do want to do it.
Yeah.
And if you fake it till you make it enough, eventually you'll find, no, you know what? I kind of am genuinely interested in solving this problem. I kind of am genuinely interested in doing these things. And it's sort of a life-changing experience.
Definitely. Yeah. 100%. I mean, and I think, yeah, the reframing and the positive growth mindset, it works really well for those reasons. And I think, yeah, sure, perhaps at a superficial level, it could be open to some sort of criticism, like, well, that's a Pollyanna-ish view of the world, but it's not, though, because I think the real, I love this, segment with Jocko Willink when he's talking about how, one of the soldiers that's under his direction comes to him with a problem, and he's just replying with good. There's a problem, something didn't go well, good. So what are you going to learn from that? So flipping the negative right away and just saying, well, it's good, you got to grow through that. We all need adversity. The only way we can grow is by facing up to limitations voluntarily and overcoming them, right? So I think that, yeah, it's uncomfortable, but that's life, right? You grow through discomfort. The key, though, is the voluntary confrontation with the challenge and whatever's causing discomfort. Again, if you're talking about Joseph Campbell and Jungian archetypal types of things, that's the hero's journey, really, isn't it?
Yeah. I remember there's an Italian film, I think, and I want to say it was called Life is Beautiful.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it was based on World War II and the Holocaust, and there was this Jewish father who him and his son got in a concentration camp, and he wants to protect his son from the harsh realities of the situation they're in. So he frames the whole thing as a game, right? Oh, hey, when the guards are around, like we're playing hide and seek and this sort of thing. And obviously it's a movie, it's a fiction, but it presents, again, that importance of reframing. And Viktor Frankl, right? I mean, he lived that to some extent, and his sort of philosophy of psychology was that there can be growth in the struggle, and I think that's what growth and struggle looks like, right? It's not denying that there's a struggle, but what it's saying is at some point in that struggle, you can reframe what your idea of struggle is, because it's all subjective, right? And it's even for different parts of our lives, right? I've always been very good academically, and it wasn't until a couple semesters ago that I got anything less than an A, right? So I have a 4.0 my whole life, and I'm doing my PhD, and then I had a professor, and some of it was on my side, some of it was on his side, but I got a B plus. And there was just a moment, right, where I was devastated. I was just, oh, my whole life, and now I tripped up and I screwed up. And that's when I could draw on all the other aspects of my life, right? And you go, well, look at how work used to be a struggle, and now how well you do. And look how your diet used to be a struggle, and how well you do. And how, when you joined the Army, you thought that the whole world was coming to an end because of how hard that experience was. And then you look back on it, and there were so many other people in the armed services that suffered much more than you did. And you go, and all this is it's just a B plus on paper. Nobody's ever going to care. I'm not necessarily even getting the degree for any specific purpose. I just like learning. So what does it matter? What does it really matter? And it's one thing to, I'm not saying grades don't matter, right? Obviously, I want to learn from that experience, and I want to continue to do better than I ever have in the past, right? And I want to challenge myself. But this idea that falling short in that way redefines who I am as a person, right? That it doesn't really hold any weight. So I think that's the importance of it, of that struggle is growth in the struggle, right? In the moment when you're fighting with something, finding that reframing moment and turning it to the best.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely, it brings to mind this funny Chris Rock segment when he says, if you want to get a diamond, you got to exert a lot of pressure on the coal, and if you just hug a lump of coal, all you're going to get is a dirty shirt.
Yeah, it's great.
I was curious to know now. Yeah, you mentioned your studies in your doctoral student in psychology. I was curious to know what particularly you're interested in or studying, or thesis type that you're working towards. Maybe you could explain a little bit of that for us.
Yeah, so I've had a pretty convoluted academic career. I started out getting an associate's in criminal justice, and then went into the Army, and then they were like, they'd paid for a lot of my school, so now I just keep going. So I got a bachelor's degree in interdisciplinary studies, and during that time I took enough upper level classes in education and psychology that I was able to get a master's degree in education off of that. And then I had to do some remedial things and write some papers and take some tests and stuff, but they accepted me into the PhD program in psychology. And so I'm not sure, I'm about 3.5 years through the 5 years of the program. So I'm coming up on the dissertation. But I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to do. And that's not frightening to me because I'm somebody who always has more ideas than time. I have friends that I talk about who talk about having writer's block, and I go, I can't even comprehend that, right? I always have ideas. So I've got, a note in my phone that's full of, I've got a separate note for song ideas, for podcast ideas, for book ideas, and for PhD dissertation ideas. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly where I'll go with it. One that I am interested in is the idea of jamais vu and creativity. So jamais vu, kind of the opposite of deja vu, right? You can take people into the lab and you can have them write a word, usually a familiar word, something that's very familiar, like the. And between 18 and 36 trials, somewhere along those lines, they'll report that the word loses its meaning. Like, hey, this doesn't mean anything to me. I'm kind of lost now. So what I'm kind of interested in is if you get people into this mind state, right? If you get people into this specific neural pattern of disassociation, if it will heighten creativity on certain tests. So that's kind of what I'm leaning towards, but I'm not exactly sure if that's the direction I'm going to go.
Yeah, that's super interesting. It kind of reflects back to what we were talking about a little bit in terms of both brain hemispheres, and how maybe by kind of just saturating that language area, as you're mentioning on the left side, maybe that just by virtue of just saturating and somehow suppressing with the repetitive exposure, then you're allowing people more access to the more creative areas of the brain on the right side, maybe.
Yeah. So I'm interested in that. I don't know if I'll be able to pursue it or not, because there's really not too much literature in that area. And so for a dissertation, they're kind of looking for you to, it's more exploring a niche of a well-worn, larger topic than it is going off and exploring something completely new. So, yeah, we'll see. I've got plenty of backup ideas to go along with it. But for me, a lot of people ask me, well, what are you going to do with it? And the answer is always move on to the next thing. I like I mentioned before, I enjoy my job. I'm lucky enough to make more money than a psychology professor makes. So that's not really, it wouldn't be a very good career move. But I enjoy it. Psychology is, we were talking about a little bit before we started recording, psychology in philosophy and neuroscience and art, like these things they have an overlapping quality to them. And so it's very difficult, right? When I'm doing a philosophy podcast or, doing my PhD studies, you do have to separate them, right? Because psychology is a social science, so you have to follow the scientific method. You can't just come in and say, well, rationally, this is what I kind of think. Well, if you're a grand theorist, that's great. Maybe people can come along and sort of prove your concepts, but otherwise, you really have to stick to the rules. Yeah. And philosophy has its own rules, but they are different, and so there has to be a separation. But at the same time, psychology, so much of it, right? Human consciousness is something that we have trouble objectively sort of describing. Yeah. And so by definition, there's a philosophical element to it, right? I always tell people that philosophy is the bookends of science, right? All science stems from philosophy, and then all science at the cutting edge dissolves back into philosophy again. And so I think human consciousness in psychological studies, that's sort of where that is, right? It kind of bleeds into that category. So I love it for that reason, right? I love both disciplines for that reason. And I like looking at it from both different perspectives, while at the same time knowing that there has to be a separation and a distinctive way of approaching, the same concept depending on what hat you're wearing.
Yeah, for sure. No, and again, it brings me back to mentioning that Theories of Everything podcast. I think you'd really enjoy that, because he interviews all kinds of people with disparate sorts of backgrounds, but the common thread through it is exactly what you're just talking about. So
Yeah, I'll definitely check it out. I like just the name of it. The name of it's very cool. So.
totally, yeah, no, absolutely. In terms of like what all of your various roles in that, I was curious to know, especially about your description of how you are also a community leader, a community organizer, it sounds like. And because for me, it's been something that I've had aspirations to get involved with, but it's just one of those things where, with kids and work, and it's just hard to fit it all in and balance it. But eventually, I do try and, participate in volunteering as much as possible with kids sports and stuff like that. But yeah, if you don't mind explaining for us, tell us a little bit about your roles as the community organizer and the activity that you have in supporting your community.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually got into politics through my podcast. So the mayor of our village happened to listen to my podcast, right? And we had a trustee who stepped down, and so the term had to be filled, and it's an elected position. But if somebody steps down, the mayor has the authority to appoint somebody until the term runs out, and then they must be reelected. So he listened to the podcast, and he met with me, and he said, "Listen, I've listened to you. You like these big picture things. You like looking at how one thing affects another and how it goes into the future." And he said, really, that's what politics is supposed to be about, right? Is, we're caretakers for the next generation with a lot of things.
Mm.
And, figuring out ways to be financially responsible and to make sure that, infrastructure is in place and that places are safe and there's new places to live and all these things are come about. That's really what it's about. He goes, so I'm hoping you'll consider doing it. And, there was part of me that was like, again, there's the generalist side, right? They go, hey, this is a new thing. I love new things. Like, I definitely want to do this. And then there's the other part of me that was like, oh man, I don't know if I have time for this. And I don't really know if it's something that I'll like.
Mm-hmm.
But it was 1 year. So I said, oh, well, I'll do it for 1 year and see how it works out. And I've really enjoyed it. It really has been exactly what he sort of summed it up to be, which is, you go and as a village trustee, it's kind of I sort of oversee the whole village, right? There's 4 people on the board of trustees as well as the mayor, and by majority vote we decide on policies for the village, and then on top of that, each trustee has different committees that they're on that oversee certain aspects. So like I mentioned at the beginning, I oversee the fire department, the police department, the parks and recreation. So, these, and part of that's like the tree board, and that's a good example, right? Because you think, oh, a tree board, like, oh, well, is it really important? Well, yeah, it kind of is, right? Because, all the trees in the village were planted at the same time in the 60s, and now they're all dying at the same time, right? And what happens when you don't have trees? Well, property values go down and air conditioning prices go, up, energy, prices go up. And there's this sort of, it's a whole cascading effect of just not having enough trees. And so, I've been working with another guy, a medical doctor in town, who's the chair of the tree board, and looking at ways to how can we plant diverse species and make it sort of like a walking arboretum, and make sure that we're cutting down the unhealthy trees, but not losing the canopy and providing all this shade and stuff. So it becomes it's something that a layperson goes, well, what's the big deal? But you get into it, and then all of a sudden you start to see the value in it, and it becomes a very satisfying way of giving back to the community, and sort of increasing the value of the village. So, yeah, I think, and even more importantly, I think that something that most people will report is that volunteer work is really, it helps you out more than it helps out anybody else. It feels good. It feels good
Yeah.
to do things for people, because that's another thing people will say is, well, man, like you'd have to pay me to do that. I wouldn't do all that work if I wasn't getting paid.
Mm,
And you go, again, that's not what it's about. Well, I think that here in Western society, everything's monetized,
yeah.
and especially our time. And there's I can understand that. I think that you should value your time more than
Mm,
anything else, right? It's your number one limited resource. Um, but putting a dollar value on it versus, um, sort of objectively, just going and trying it out and seeing
mm.
how it helps you, how it helps the people around you, how it makes you feel, and what kind of impact you have. It's not really giving it a fair shake if you just go, nah, well, I could be making money, but
Mhm.
uh,
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense, right? I mean, I think probably it probably encourages a healthy relationship with time and money too, right? Because there is this idea of more of the intangible value that you probably would get by networking, and being able to just spend time with like-minded people who are also volunteering. And so there's this mutual recognition of the fact that you're committed to a goal in the interest of improving the community, and you're volunteering your time for it. And so it just provides you the whole group of, politicians that are working together with that network to say, and this is what really builds foundations of communities. It must be, and but as far as if there's to be some sort of personal gain that may be as a byproduct of those efforts, right? Maybe the networking piece of it could be that, right? You could say, well, oh, well, we have these relationships. And so then, the networking. And I guess that's what, just occurred to me, is that perhaps that opens the door for nepotism and corruption to a certain extent. So if you have, guarding against that, perhaps that's where there's some sort of, you know, gap where cynicism might be able to sort of leak into the whole discussion, right? But I think just to have the political experience by itself must be a very interesting kind of journey for you.
yeah, yeah, and there's so many ways to get involved, that are easy to do. You can just walk into them. And so being a trustee is not that, right? Like, I got lucky because I got appointed, but um, then I'm running for reelection, right? And so, um, I'm worried about that because I'm an independent, right? I'm a registered independent. But I sought cross nomination, so I went to the Republican caucus and I said, hey, I've been doing the job for a year, and I've been really giving it my all. I'm hoping you'll nominate me. And I did the same thing at the Democratic one, and they both nominated me for the position, right? So, and again, that's what politics is supposed to be, right? Is going, okay, hey, I see this guy around town, painting fences, planting trees, doing things that make a difference in the community, right? Um,
Mm,
is at board meetings, they're passing laws or doing stuff that we see as valuable to the community. What does the political affiliation matter? It really doesn't, right? As long
yeah,
as they're doing the job right. But it's an elected position, right? So
mm,
if you're not doing something right, you could get voted out. So there's, yeah, there's, and it's different in a small town, but there's mechanisms to keep things fair and honest, um, and you don't have to be an elected person to have just as big of an impact, right? Any you can go anywhere and volunteer, and be with people who are like-minded and want to make the village a better place. And by extension, right, if you make your little corner of the world a better place, you're making the whole world a better place to some extent. So
yeah, definitely. No, for sure. I mean, it makes me think of what you described there as, you're fortunate in terms of being able to fall asleep pretty much right away after a busy day. But I think, it made me think of the idea that, to starting off the day with an idea of focusing in on the day, sort of aiming in a sense at what you might want to accomplish, aiming at the highest good, focusing in on the day. And perhaps the highest good might be, not thinking of yourself so much, but thinking of others and thinking of, your household and then the broader community. And then finishing the day and just saying to yourself, well, I did my best to try and, take care of those people that are close to me and take care of my community, take care of myself to the extent that I need to in order to maintain that from day to day. And that probably helps, with restful sleep at night.
Yeah. Again, it comes back to just knowing that you're doing your best, and whatever it is, and balancing that with some self-compassion, right? And so if you know that you did the best that you could, and you know what, if you screwed up, you have another shot at it tomorrow, or, you learned a lesson, whatever the case may be, then stress and pressure really don't have the opportunity to creep in. You can kind of keep things level-headed and keep a good perspective on how things are going.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm interested to hear more about the podcast. It sounds really interesting in terms of the theme and how it got started. But maybe if you don't mind just explaining a little bit about how did it get started and expanding on that, and what you guys have been talking about lately.
Sure. Yeah. So we started 6 years ago, and it was, again, just sort of born out of a generalist position to want to do a new thing. I'd been making a lot of music, and all of a sudden I looked around, I go, I have a recording studio. I could make a podcast. And I go, well, what would it be about? And I go, well, I love philosophy, because my whole life I've been somebody who's believed that everything is philosophical and everybody is a philosopher, And I thought back to my very first philosophy class in community college with my professor, who, really him and my mom, I sort of credit with getting me the love of learning that I have. My mom was always the type of person where school wasn't just something you did from 7 to 3. After school, she'd take us to the museum, and she'd go, look at these dinosaur bones. Aren't these things crazy? Could you imagine when this thing was alive, what it would look like?
Yeah.
And pretty soon you're running around the museum reading every single placard because it's so interesting, So anywhere we went, my mom was always making things educational in a sneaky way that you didn't know. And so that kind of carried with me. And my first philosophy professor, the same way, he didn't give us textbooks to read. He gave us actual books, right? Metaphors we live by, and other works of philosophy. And then, we'd come into class, and rather than there being a lecture or a lesson plan of any kind, he'd just ask us about the books, right? And there'd be these conversations that would start up that were very organic and interesting, and would go back and forth. And so 10 years after I left community college, I'm sitting in this music studio going, I could do a podcast. And I go, I should do a philosophy podcast. And I said, I wonder what Norm's up to. So after 10 years of not talking, I just got a hold of him and said, hey, would you be interested in doing a philosophy podcast? And he said, yeah, sure. And so it started. We thought, well, we'll just do 10 episodes, just the biggest topics in philosophy: God, time, free will, these sorts of things. And we got to the end of the 10 episodes, and we said, there's way too much other stuff to talk about. We can't possibly stop here. And so we've continued on for the past 6 years. We just did our 200th episode a little while ago, and we've covered all kinds of stuff, right? We've continued to probe some of those very deep, big topics that sort of pervade philosophy. But we've also done down-to-earth things. We did Disney princesses one episode. My wife came on as the guest, and we've done entertainment franchise reboots, and we've done all kinds of things, right? To just demonstrate that any topic is philosophical and everybody's a philosopher. And I think that the more people engage in that mindset, the healthier you are and the better appreciation you have for life. And everybody has that topic, right? Everybody has something that they're so passionate about, where, if you're a layperson, you'll look at it and go, oh, okay, well, this is just that. And somebody will say, no. Let me explain how nuanced this is and how much there is that goes into this.
Mm.
And it brings any concept to life, and it makes everything interesting. And so that's what we've been trying to do for the past 6 years, is again looking at just one concept each week and really picking it apart And what you find is that the title of the episode or the title of the podcast is pretty spot on. From nowhere to nothing, right?
Mm.
We look at it and it's not that we don't get anywhere, but what you find is that coming to concrete or solid answers is so much harder than you could possibly imagine. That even reviewing the history and the literature, and then rationally debating it among yourselves, and sort of asking these questions. At the end of every episode, we say, man, there's more to talk about. You could always continue to go on. The conversation could never end.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, and even just like, I'm getting started with this, and it's just been so much fun just for that very reason, and just meeting people, having open conversations, and just learning, enriching knowledge, in both directions, and disseminating that. I think I'm really optimistic about the future of this type of media in general. And I was curious how, with your experience that way over the past 6 years, and seeing the landscape out in front of us in terms of the podcasting world and long form conversations, how do you see the role of these kinds of long form conversations in, this era of short attention spans and kind of clickbait, TikTok kinds of short videos?
Yeah, I think that it's a sort of sad, but I think that at the same time, it's only sad if you view it from one perspective. From the other perspective, I think that it's very hopeful. But I think that part of the reason podcasts are so successful is that a lot of people don't have these kind of conversations in their regular everyday life anymore. I was fortunate enough to grow up just before the technological era. So I remember coming of age and staying out till 2 or 3 in the morning with my friends, staring up at the sky on the hoods of our cars, talking about, hey man, what do you think came before the universe, right?
Yeah.
And nowadays it just seems it seems crazy to imagine having that kind of time on your hands as a teenager or as an adult or as a kid, right? All of us, our schedules have become so saturated. And I think largely through technological means, right? Some of it's real, some of it is a real saturation, but some of it is just this need to fill up every second of time with screen time. Oh, hey, I've got 30 seconds you know, before work, I might as well pull out my phone and see what's going on social media or on the news or whatever. That sort of negative space, that blank canvas, not only is that good just for your own thinking, but when you combine it with your social relationships, right? Having that empty space and having the ability to engage with somebody else in that space, and how that deepens a relationship, it's very important. And I think that it's missing. And I think that podcasts are now where people are sort of fulfilling that, right? They hear you and me having a conversation and they go, man, this is so cool. It scratches that itch, right? And so my hope, right, would be to see people having these conversations in everyday life. And everybody right now is going, I don't have an hour to sit down and talk to somebody. Well, let me tell you, if I have an hour to sit down and talk to somebody, you have an hour to sit down and talk to somebody,
Yeah,
right?
for sure. No, it's
And
inspiring.
and it's important. It's very important, right? This is what energizes us, and this was what helps us grow, right? Is hearing somebody's different perspective and incorporating what they're having to say into your own knowledge base, right? And so I think that going forward, podcasts will continue to be successful. And as a matter of fact, I was reading some analytics that show that they're continuing to grow, right? They're continuing to grow.
Oh yeah.
And I think that, there's different niches, right? Some are just selling things or trying to promote, business ventures. And I think there's always the danger of ending up in an echo chamber, right? Going down a far right or a far left or wherever stream, and just having something that reinforces your own thinking. But I think by and large, right, it's people who want to have deep conversations with other people. And I think that the audience, by and large, is people who want to hear deep conversations with other people. And then they want to take it and chew on it on their own. And I think that that's a very healthy and inspiring thing. And I think that podcasts will be good for that, even if it doesn't reemerge in the social milieu at any time. But
Yeah, for sure. Well, I love how it's open source too, right? I mean, it's accessible. The cost of production is way down. I mean, you have a lot of knowledge and experience about that in terms of what you know about music production and your experience there. But just the Gutenberg revolution of YouTube and these various other podcasting platforms and allowing people to just have the reach for a very low cost, right? Not only cost of production, but cost of consuming, is basically zero pretty much on both
yeah,
sides. So it's super interesting that way. And it's it provides an optimistic kind of perspective on people connecting and people learning from one another. And yeah, like I know it's the way I kind of think about it often, it's an evolution of the old talk radio or call-in, shows that you'd kind of have, it would be fun to listen to while you're driving, and I think it probably also fills a need for folks that are lonely these days. I mean, there's an epidemic of loneliness, and I think these kinds of media outlets and platforms really help people feel as though they're not only learning but spending time with people that they're listening to in a way, right?
yeah, absolutely. And as an artist, like, it's a good point, the production aspect of it, right? Because I remember when I started music, I could make a ton of money at music, right? Because people had to buy my albums, and I could sell an album for $10 and $7 of it would be my money, right? Now, if I release an album, nobody buys it, right? They just stream it and I make 0.1 cent or whatever. So I don't make any money on music. And a lot of artists complain about that, rightfully so, right? If you're trying to make a living being an artist, then it's a very difficult thing. But for somebody like me who cares more about the doing aspect of it and getting it in front of people more so than making money, I think it's great, right? I think it's great that everybody can get their voice out there, right, and can be heard and can engage in the environment, that because the production aspect of it has become so cheap and so easy. So yeah, I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, no, definitely super interesting. I was curious to know, if there's a younger, person that's listening or watching and interested in, achieving a lot of the things that you've managed to achieve and balancing the things that you've talked about balancing in your day-to-day life. Is there any particular advice or suggestions that you might give to someone who's perhaps in school or an early stage career who is looking to cultivate a more of a generalist approach to their work-life balance, day-to-day living in general, but maybe feels more pressured to specialize? How would you encourage that people seek that balance?
Yeah, I think about this a lot because I don't have kids of my own, but I live next door to my brother, and he has a couple kids, and so I've seen my niece and nephew grow up. My nephew now is 10 years old, and what I realize, right, is that what you need um, to be a generalist, right, you have from the very beginning,
Hmm.
right? People, there's always this trope in common, in media of the kid asking, why, or what's that, what's this, what's that, and then the parent just going, because, right? That's the thing, is kids are naturally curious, right? Kids are naturally engaged in the world, right? And I think that some of our, like you mentioned, the meat grinder of school or of business or these sorts of things. Yes, our culture is set up to pound that out of them,
Hmm.
but that is foundational. That's a foundational element of being a human being, is being interested, being curious, being excited, right? And so it I if there's somebody young out there, I would say hang on to that, right? Because I had that when I was young, and then I lost it, right, in my teenage years up through my early 20s, and then I had to find it again. And it's a lot of work to find it again. If you can just hang on to it, then you'll live a successful life, right? And again, it doesn't matter, you know, we're not defining success here as being the richest person on earth. Because you wanna know what? If you're the richest person on earth, that's not gonna make you happy. That's not what happiness is, right? So happiness isn't even really the goal itself. It's more of a eudaimonia, right? This idea of of living a fulfilled life, right? Something that feels enriching, right? And that's all right there. It's all in front of you. And if you just hold on to that, it's better to be a child, right? If you hang on to that, what you were born with, what your birthright is as a human being, the ability to be curious and to be interested and to be excited, then that's the key. That's all there is to it, right? Just don't let the world beat you down. Stay engaged.
Nice. Yeah, I love it. I think that's fantastic. I love that idea of curiosity and encouraging people to just try and maintain a sense of childlike curiosity in the way that they approach their day-to-day living. And yeah, I think that'll serve them well. So thanks very much for that.
Yeah.
I think that's a good place to end. Maybe if you don't mind, let us know again. So the podcast name, your book name, again, all of these various relevant endeavors and content we'll put in the show notes. But yeah, maybe just explain for viewers and listeners again.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm the world's worst marketer, so I don't have a great online presence, right? Most of the time I'm just doing stuff, and if people find it, great. But if they don't, I haven't put a whole lot of effort into it. But, if you go on to Apple Music, Spotify, wherever, you can Google my name, Joel Bouchard. I'll pop up. You'll see my albums and EPs and singles on there. It's primarily alternative rock, but I like to experiment a little bit. So there's some progressive things that are long form. There's some shorter kind of jazz fusion type things. The podcast is From Nowhere to Nothing. So anywhere you listen to podcasts, you can look it up. You can find that about philosophy. And the book is The Sleeper, The Scholar, and The Strix. And so that's on Amazon. You can find that there.
Very good. That's so cool. All right. Thanks again for a great discussion. I learned a lot. Like I said before, I'm going to check out your book and your podcast and your music. I'm really looking forward to it. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you again for joining us today, and just wish you all the best.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun.
Okay, cheers. Take care.
Yep.
Bye-bye.